Hello, welcome to Masters of the Deal. I'm John Okomayin. I lead the customer success team at Ideals. I work with world's top deal makers to help them close complex transactions using our virtual data room. On this podcast, I sit down with M&A leaders to explore their career journeys, uncovering their experiences, lessons, and defining moments that shape their success. Join us to discover what it takes to become a master of the deal. James, I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast. Welcome to Masters of the Deal.
Thanks very much, John. It's great to be here.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time. Would like to start off with exploring a bit of your personal journey and your background. Can you please take us through early part of your career or your career journey from M&A at Rothschild to your current position at Barclays?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, let's get into it. So, I read economics and politics at the University of Leeds, and when I left university, I really felt the need for the benefit of having a professional qualification beyond university. So I started off at KPMG, the accountancy and professional services firm, as an auditor and getting my accountancy qualification. And I did that for 3 years and actually really enjoyed that period of time, and still wasn't really sure when I came out of that 3 years what I wanted to do next. But I saw a lot of my colleagues going and interviewing for roles at investment banks, and I thought, well, why not? I should at least spend a bit of time exploring the market. And M&A was something which was really, really interesting to me. So that's where I started to explore. And I was very clear, though, on the type of organisation I wanted to work for. So, culture and alignment of principles between the organisation I work for and my own personal sort of views have always been really important to me. So there was very specific companies that I explored, and I was fantastically lucky to get a job at Rothschild. So this was back in 2000. So I took a role which was in the financial institutions team at Rothschild, and I ended up being there for 13 really, really happy years. And Rothschild is quite a unique institution. I mean, as many people will know, it's family owned. It has a relatively limited set of products, certainly compared to a big integrated investment bank. So it's very focused on advisory, and those two things together give it quite a unique flavour. One of the things it means the culture very much comes down from the family who own the organisation. It means that they as owners take a long-term view of the business. They're not, for example, impacted by quarterly reporting. So it means that they can take a really strategic view of the conversations they have with their clients. And there are many examples of us advising our clients not to do a transaction because we thought it was in the client's best interests. And I was also very lucky to have a really broad range of experience over that 13 years, all within the financial services sector. But I worked across the spectrum of different areas of financial services, and really got experience at a very early stage on a number of the deals. Really good experience on a number of the deals I did. I think one of the real highlights of that 13-year period was the financial crisis, which was on the one hand, a fascinating time to be in finance and in M&A. On the other hand, it was frankly at times quite a terrifying experience. And for those of your listeners who do remember working through the financial crisis, they'll know what I mean. I mean, I can literally recall now that moment where someone heard that, and I think it's true, that banks were within 20 minutes, or one of the major banks in the UK had said where they were within 20 minutes of running out of cash in their machines in the hole in the wall, which is not something that people do so much these days, but certainly 20 years ago, going and getting your cash out of the hole in the wall was the way you paid for things. So it was a fascinating time, and we did some really, really interesting work over the financial crisis, particularly with a number of governments across Europe, helping them to recapitalise their banking systems and helping particular banks sort of sort out their balance sheets over that period of time. So one of the things I did was work with the government of Denmark to recapitalise or create a structure and a system to recapitalise pretty much their entire banking system. Another really interesting piece of work was working with the government of Dubai to set up effectively a liquidity support fund for a number of the corporates in the country. So it was a really interesting time. I was also very lucky to spend 2 periods of time overseas with Rothschild. So a lot of the work I did actually was international. Although I was based in London for a big portion of the time, I did a lot of work across Europe and a lot of work across the Middle East. But I spent a year based in Hong Kong, and then ended up going out to Singapore in 2010. And so I ended up spending 5 years of my career in Singapore. And again, it was a really wonderful time personally, but also professionally. Having said that, it's a very different, or at least it was a very different environment for banking, and advice is certainly was a little bit less valued by the client base in Asia, and financing is very important to the selection of advisors on transactions. And at the time, I worked my way up. So by then I was a director of Rothschild, and I was really sort of thinking, okay, what do I do now as the next stage of my career? And do I want to commit myself to being a senior banker for the rest of my career? And anyway, I thought that maybe that now would be the time to do something a little bit different. And so again, I looked into the market, and I was lucky enough to find a role at Deutsche Bank. So this was back in 2013. And so I left Rothschild and joined Deutsche, still in Singapore. And in that role, I was leading Deutsche Bank's internal M&A, so all of their corporate M&A across Asia Pacific. And this was a big step for a couple of reasons. One, I talked a bit about the culture of Rothschild and being a very unique organization. And here I was moving into an organization which had as many people in Singapore as Rothschild had globally, give or take. And obviously a much larger organization, much more complicated. And that really takes some time to get used to and to adjust to and to navigate, to work out the ways of navigating your way around an organization and getting things done. And then the second point was I moved from being, an advisor, just really, supporting and helping, advising clients who were doing transactions, to being a principal as well. So that was sort of a second thing that I really need to get used to and accustomed to. So I did that for a couple of years, and so I came up to 2015. I'd been in Singapore, as I said, for 5 years, and my wife and I decided to move back to the UK for personal reasons, kids getting into their critical school age period, etc. And so I moved back to London, and I joined Barclays. And I've been at Barclays for now just over 10 years, in broadly 3, now 4 roles, because I just moved into my 4th role. So I started off in a couple of strategic roles, so in internal strategy roles. First of all, working in the investment bank, and then moving into a group strategy role. And this was around the time that the previous CEO had come into the organisation. So we spent a lot of time with the CEO, helping him think through his new strategy, working with the Group Executive Committee to implement that strategy. Brexit happened during that period, so we very much led the strategic response that the bank had to Brexit. So a really interesting breadth of strategic roles through that period of time. At the back end of that period in strategy, I actually spent some time working with the CEO of the retail bank, thinking about his strategy, and that led to my second role. So I'd done strategy for about 2.5 years, and then as part of that thinking of strategy, the CEO of the retail bank was thinking about how he could react to the rise of fintechs. And fintechs were really exploding in that period. This was 2017, 2018, really disrupting the market. And sort of the idea was, how do we what's our strategic response to that? How do we get to act more like a fintech does, which is quite different in nature and scale and speed to how a large regulated will tend to operate. And so we set up something called Barclays Ventures, and Barclays Ventures was a unit within the retail bank that was designed to try to almost disrupt the bank from within, but act and think like a younger, more nimble technology company might do. We try to build products within the business. We invested in early stage technology companies from outside of Barclays and helped to co-create new products and services with them. This was again another quite significant shift in my career and the way I thought about things and the way I worked, because up until this point I'd worked in a corporate role. I had I'd advised large corporates, I'd worked in large banks in strategy and M&A, and now I was working with young technology companies. I was doing the full-on sort of jeans and t-shirt type thing coming into the office. We hired some fantastic people from outside of Barclays, people who weren't career financial services people or career bankers, but people who came with a very, very different culture and mindset of how to build a business. So again, it was a really interesting part of my career. That lasted for about 3 years into the back end of COVID, and that's when I pivoted again, and I moved into sort of my third role I've had in Barclays, and that was in the whole sustainable finance space. And I did a couple of roles in that period. First of all, in investor relations, where I led our conversations with our institutional shareholders, particularly around ESG. And going back, this was 2021, 2022. Lots of demands from institutional shareholders as to what they wanted Barclays to be doing, and obviously all other corporates. Really fascinating period. I learned a lot, and we at the end of that particular period, we held what was called a Say on Climate vote at our AGM, where we put our sustainability policies to a shareholder vote at the AGM in 2022, and which got 80% of our shareholders voting in favour. I then moved back into the investment bank, where I became chief of staff to the head of sustainable finance for Barclays, and helped him really develop his strategy, build his team, connect across the organisation in terms of bringing together a sustainable finance ecosystem and really helping to build and accelerate the business, which was Barclays beginning to build before that, but which we really sort of put some shape, put some resource around it, really helped to turbocharge that. And that was very much a typical chief of staff role, and really very, very enjoyable. And so I did that for about in total about 3.5 years, those two roles in sustainability. And then earlier in the year, I moved into my most recent and my current role, which is in the private bank in Barclays, where I'm helping to really focus on some strategic operating model initiatives for the business.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing that. I mean, it's very interesting to see how you've moved the trajectory of your career progression over the years into different roles, and the way you've thought about them, and dealt with a very wide range of people on your team and clients as well. So thank you very much for sharing that. When you think back, were there any early deals that taught you any lessons that you still carry on with you today?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think all, every deal is unique. Every transaction you do helps to teach you something, because you put yourself in a different situation, you work with different people, you have to learn new things. And I think even the most experienced banker will continue to find that they'll learn things as they go. Having said that, you obviously do build up a knowledge base and understanding of how to do transactions. So I'm going to answer your question with two deals. One is my very first deal, and my very first deal was to advise a it was a very standard transaction in the sense of it was advising a major bank in the UK on selling a car finance, car leasing business they had. But I guess I still look back on that deal very fondly because it taught me the basics of how to do a transaction, in that case, how to run a sell-side auction. And although, as I say, each deal you do, you learn new things, that deal set the benchmark for me in how to run a set transaction successfully, what you need to do, what the foundational elements are. So I think I was very lucky to do that deal very, very early on in my career and get that baseline. The second transaction, another transaction which will live on in my mind very fondly, was a very first transaction that I think I led in terms of originating it through to completing it. And so I was sort of just being made a director in Rothschild, and obviously my role had evolved very much, and I was now, as I say, doing a lot more origination. And it was a significant deal for one of the very large Japanese banks who was buying a portfolio of project finance assets in the UK. So sort of 2009, 2010. And what stuck with me from that transaction, and what really I think is worth people taking away, is that was a transaction which came about from about 3 years of marketing to that Japanese bank. And I actually remember when I first made a visit to Japan to speak to that Japanese bank, and I was people at Rothschild questioned me a little bit to say, and I wasn't super senior at that point in time, but people said, look, you sure this is worthwhile? The Japanese culture is quite hierarchical. Do you think it's worthwhile spending time with them, building their relationships? And it was. I identified a client who had a strategic interest in doing something in Europe, who had growth ambitions, who needed support. I could see a pathway to building a relationship, and it took time. And it took perseverance. And people listening to this will know that transactions come from a number of different places. So sometimes it's an idea that you take a client and they want you to advise them, and sometimes a client just comes to you because they have their own idea, but they want somebody who they trust, who they have a relationship with, to help them execute it. And that was very much the case in that particular instance.
Yeah, fantastic. Very, very great examples there. The first one you actually worked with, and the first one you led. So I can see why those will stick with you. Yeah, it's fantastic. Okay. How did your experience shape your move into strategic and sustainable finance roles?
Yeah, look, I think I've always found my experience in M&A, that 13 years or 15 years of doing M&A, as just being a fantastic foundation for everything I've done since then. It teaches you so much, which is so good and is so applicable to other things in your career. Whether or not that's the technical foundations of valuation, or using Excel to run a model, or it's the problem solving and working with a client to work through challenges in an M&A transaction, or the strategic mindset that you've got to develop to be able to go and talk to a client about why a piece of M&A fits into their broader strategic ambitions, or whether it's the importance of communication, whatever it might be. There's just a whole range of skills which you learn, and I honestly think there are very, very few careers, very, very few jobs where you get that breadth of rigor and strategy and working with fantastic people in high pressured situations. And it's just a great learning, a great platform, a great skill base to then go on and do other things. I don't think it's much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Those relationships you form along the way and experiences would just give you that wide spectrum to deal with other pieces of work. Thank you very much for sharing that. Okay. If we delve into some of your memorable deals and how they influence your approach today, um, you mentioned the financial crisis a couple of times already, so I thought we'd touch on that. So during that period, you worked on a memorable deal with the Japanese clients, as you mentioned. Tell us a bit more about what that was like, and what did it teach you about working under pressure?
Yeah, so actually, the deal I want to talk about in this case is not the one I talked about earlier. So this one was actually the client in this case wasn't Japanese, but the counterparty was Japanese, and this truly is my favourite transaction that I've ever worked on, and it's tinged with. It was a difficult transaction in the case of it. It had a real, very personal consequences for many other people during that financial crisis. But this was the sale of Lehman Brothers Asia business right at the height of the financial crisis. So Lehman Brothers had filed for bankruptcy, and we got a call at Rothschild about a few days later from the management team in Asia saying, we need to find a buyer for our business. And a recurring theme of a lot of the business a lot of the work we did over the financial crisis was it needs to be done by Monday morning. And so people, banks and governments repeatedly saw something coming down the track whereby they had a few days, and the weekend with the markets being closed always gave them that leeway. But they knew that if something wasn't sorted by Monday morning when the markets opened, that's when the trouble would really hit. So we got a call, I think it was on a Tuesday, asking us to pitch for this piece of business. We were in London, and the management team was across Asia in Tokyo from memory at the time. And so I think we did a 7 a.m. Wednesday morning video conference, which was a pitch for this piece of work. I remember we had another piece of business to do, so we did that pitch. We went out to do another piece of business. We came back later that day, and we were told, "You got the piece of business. You need to be on a plane to Hong Kong the next night." It may have even been that day actually. And so a team of us rushed home. We packed our bags. We got on a plane, and we arrived in Hong Kong on Friday evening or late Friday afternoon, knowing that we had until Monday morning to effectively find a buyer for the business across Asia. So, absolutely one where you're working under pressure. I think, it was one of those where I don't think maybe I got a couple of hours sleep between Friday evening and Monday morning, but it definitely wasn't much more than that. So it was clearly, it was a great deal to work on. It was really, really intense. But I think the lesson that I would take away from that particular transaction was the value of preparation and planning. Clearly, we arrived on Friday afternoon. There was wheels were in motion, things were already happening. Buyers knew that there was something afoot and were starting to, were expressing interest. But and we could have just gone sort of straight in to meetings and execution. But I do remember that we took the time on Friday afternoon, Friday evening, to say, okay, we've got 48 hours. We've got a little bit more than 48 hours. How do we use this time in the right way? What are the steps that we need to take? And just taking that period of reflection and planning before we got really going. I guess it was 8 o'clock on Saturday morning. That really set us up in the right way for a successful weekend.
Fantastic. A great example of a high pressure situation, and I think your expressions tell us that it's what even more rewarding with a successful outcome at the end. So
absolutely, yeah, that's right.
Okay. When you moved from advising deals at Rothschilds to executing acquisitions and divestitures internally at Deutsche Bank, what were the biggest lessons you had to learn?
Yeah, so I talked earlier about the change in the type of organisation, and that, as I said, that was a really big a mental shift for me to understand how to succeed in a very different type of organisation I worked in previously. But I think the second part of it was the role itself. And I think there is a real difference between acting as an advisor and acting as a principal. And that's not that one is better than the other, far from it. They're just different, and they do require a different mindset. And so when you're principal, you are there sitting in a room, taking decisions, and the buck stops with you, as opposed to when you're advisor and someone is really just looking for you for support and help. But ultimately, you're not the one making those decisions. And you really have to think about that as you approach a transaction. And it's very important that as a transaction goes on, you take people within the organisation along with you on the journey, and almost federate out, if you like, that responsibility. And so it's really important to have that communication and have that process for making sure that people are comfortable with where the direction of travel and what the ultimate outcome is going to be. And I think there are not everyone who's worked in investment banking is fortunate enough to have done that work as a principal as well. And I actually think having worked as an advisor and a principal is a very powerful combination, and actually was very useful for my then move into other roles in banking, in particular in strategy. But there was one particular episode which, again, it taught me a lot, and I think it's worth just reflecting on. So we, as well as doing M&A, leading the M&A across Asia for Deutsche Bank, I was also helped to look after some of the large strategic shareholdings that Deutsche Bank had in a couple of regional businesses. And there was one particular situation. So Deutsche held a stake. I can't remember exactly how big it was, and the business wanted to do something. They wanted to put in place an employee share and a share plan, and it required us as shareholder to vote on that, on putting that share plan in place. And it was a very complex share plan. It was quite valuable for the employees. So it was quite a significant thing, and it was quite important for Deutsche Bank to be on board and supportive, and it was going to have fairly material impact on the value of their shareholding. So we did a lot of work analysing the proposals that the management were putting forward, and it had to flow through the regional investment committee to get approval. And so the investment committee date was all lined up, and we started our socialisation of the people on the investment committee, and we put in time with each of the members, and we took them through it. And as we went round, they all said yes, this is complex. We can see there's some pros and cons, but ultimately, we can see how there's a way through, and we'll be supportive. So the day of the investment committee came, and we slightly cautiously went to the investment committee to present it. And we started presenting it. As I say, they all knew about it, but we started doing the formal element of the presentation. And one investment committee member, so about halfway through, said, "Yeah, I'm not sure I'm fully on board with this. I have, I'm concerns over this, concerns over," and literally everyone around the table piped up in exactly the same way, and the meeting just hit the buffers. And look, there's nothing we could have done about it, because we had done the socialisation ahead. We had tried to get everyone comfortable and pre-socialise the initiative, but ultimately it just taught me you can never be certain, and so always be prepared for something to come out of left field. As I say, not much you can do about it per se, but other than be prepared, and therefore you can be prepared and forewarned, you can deal with it in the best possible way.
Yeah, absolutely. We hear stories like this all the time, where a curveball comes out of nowhere, and you can only control what you can control, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Looking back at deal-making principles you've relied on, negotiation, for example, relationship building, strategic thinking, How do they guide your work today?
Yeah, so I think, look, we touched on this a little bit in terms of, I think the foundational experiences and skills that I learned through my M&A career, I think have popped up in all manner of different places. I mean, I was just thinking as I was talking earlier about my career history, and I said I went into investor relations. Investor relations was drew on a number of those skills that I learned through M&A. And effectively, investor relations is, how do you define a strategy? How do you communicate your strategy to shareholders? So it really draws on a number of those skills that I learned. But I guess if I was to pick one particular skill, which I think is really important, and I have again also touched on this, is the power of relationships. And at Rothschild, because it was predominantly an advisory business, Rothschild, we didn't have money to lend into M&A situations. So we were, the business that we won on the strength of our relationship with our client and the strength of our intellectual capital. But that relationship-based approach to M&A was really, really ingrained. And I think, in today's day and age, when there's a rise of technology all around us, and AI or whatever it might be, I think it's worth just people remembering the power of the personal relationship and the power of the human touch, and how that really does continue to make a very, very important difference in business. I think in all types of business, actually.
Absolutely, in all walks of life, I would add. Just the relationship.
I think that's right.
Cornerstone. Absolutely. Okay. If we look into a bit more into ESG, it's a hot topic at the moment. It's been a hot topic for a while, and you've touched on it earlier. Let's think about the impact on company strategy and client engagement. So during your time at Barclays, when you moved away from M&A and worked in a number of roles across the bank, how did the variety of roles come about?
So yeah, a couple of questions in there, I guess. One is the different roles that I've done in Barclays, and then talking about ESG and sustainability specifically. Look, I think one of the great advantages of working in an organisation like Barclays is the variety of things that you can do. And if it wasn't clear from the answer to my first question, I have worked literally in every part of Barclays. So I've worked in the investment bank, I've worked in the retail bank, I've worked in sort of the central functions in sustainability and investor relations, and now I've worked in the private bank. So I've been very fortunate to work across the entire bank, and to some extent those roles have. There's been a natural evolution of a number of those roles. So in particular, the move from strategy into Barclays Ventures was a very natural role. The move from my investor relations time in sustainability into my chief of staff role in sustainability, again, very natural, movement as my career progressed. That said, I have moved out of my comfort zone quite deliberately and quite significantly on a number of occasions. I talked a bit about ventures, and I talked about how that was a very, a significant move from really working in very much corporate roles to working with the early stage ecosystem. So that was, sort of one example. When I moved into sustainability, I was aware of sustainability. If you look at ESG, I had plenty of experience in the G, in governance, in terms of various roles that I'd done in my career, but I didn't have much experience of the environmental or the social. And so I had to, as I moved into those different roles, I had to really upskill myself and learn new things very rapidly in order to succeed in those roles. And I say that was, to some extent, a deliberate thing, because I've always liked to stretch myself. I always wanted to continue to develop myself as an individual and in my professional capacity. So it's been quite deliberate. But I'm also, as I say, a strong believer in challenging yourself. I'm a strong believer that you can do more than you think you can. And no, I think I've demonstrated that, and I love the sort of idea that people talk about, which is if you're offered a job that you think is interesting, but you're not sure whether you can do it, accept it, and then work out how you can do it afterwards. Because people don't tend to offer you jobs and offer you roles where they don't think that you're going to be able to do it, because that's not good for anybody. So, by all means, walk into roles being a little bit nervous or thinking to yourself, I'm not sure I've got the skills and experience to land this and be able to do it on day one. But go into those roles with confidence that you have got the skill base and you will be able to learn, and you will have people around you who will support you, and you will ultimately get there. Because I think that makes for a much more exciting and more rounded career at the end of the day. And you talked there about sustainability, and I said that was a classic example for me where I needed to move into. I moved into a role where I had to learn new material. And the world has moved very quickly in sustainability over the past, 3 or 4 years, and it's a very different world in terms of, I think, the way that corporates think about ESG and sustainability, but just as importantly, how stakeholders outside the organisations think about ESG and sustainability. So whether or not that's shareholder expectations, or regulator expectations, or customer expectations, it's definitely a very fast-moving environment. And I, partly, let's be clear, partly that is a sort of, it reflects the political environment around the world as well. And I think some commentators, have sort of expressed a view that maybe sustainability, ESG, has become less relevant for corporates and investors over the past couple of years. I'm not so sure about that myself. I think it's just reflecting the different phases of the way people approach it. And I think it's, what I do think we're in is, I think we're in a much more pragmatic phase than, for want of a better word, and maybe an idealistic phase than we were maybe 3 or 4 years ago in terms of the solutions to some of the challenges that we have. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, I think these issues will continue to be important for our stakeholders, in particular our customers. And if they're important for our customers, they're therefore important for Barclays or any corporate. And I think it's going to, addressing these issues head on and in the right way is going to continue to be a critical part of the social license to operate for all large or small firm and organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. On that note, then, do you see, or how do you see it shaping priorities for companies and investors in the years ahead, ESG particularly, and sustainable finance?
Look, I think a lot of organisations now, and I think this is for those organisations that haven't. I think this is the direction of travel. These questions are just becoming part of the BAU of setting and executing strategy. I think whenever you get a new concept, a new idea, we thought with technology probably 15 years ago, and to some extent AI, but the corporates go through a phase whereby it's sort of whatever the issue in question is sort of dealt with by a group of people or a team whose responsibility it is to think about, in this case, sustainability or ESG, and they're brought in to the strategic conversation at particular points in time. I think where we're moving to is an understanding that this is something which everybody throughout an organisation, as they're thinking about their strategy, and when I talk about strategy, I'm talking about not only big picture corporate strategy, but just how do you approach your the strategy of how do you approach your client. Let's apply it to an M&A banker. How does an M&A banker think about sustainability issues in the context of an M&A transaction, and they're pitching to their client? So I think it's just becoming, it's coming part of the BAU, and that is ultimately where it needs to get to. So everybody has the skills, everybody has a knowledge base, and everybody is thinking about these things just in the same way as they'll think about 15 other topics as they set and execute their strategy.
Yeah, so it's part and parcel of the direction of travel. It's not going anywhere, effectively.
Exactly, 100%.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that. Now, let's move slightly into your leadership approach, and if you had to have any advice for younger and aspiring people. So what's one piece of advice would you give someone aiming to operate at a senior level in M&A, corporate finance, or strategic advisory?
Look, I think it's not an easy question now, because I think the pathway to senior roles in M&A or strategy are very varied, and different and very different people who are all very successful will get to the top through a different variety of different pathways. Look, personally speaking, I think particularly when I think back to my M&A days, the most impressive senior bankers that I remember are those who had a breadth of understanding, a real breadth of understanding across industries that they were working in. So you tended to have people, the more senior you become in as a banker, you often will specialise in one particular part of. Maybe you'll target a particular sector, or even a subsector of a particular sector. You might become a lead banker to just one or two very, very large corporates in a sector. But as I say, I always felt that the most impressive bankers were those who had more breadth than that. And but having said that, specialism is important. So the point I'm getting to is what I've always taken with me, and a number of people who've been mentors to me during my career have always talked about this concept of a T. So think about your experience as a T-shaped. You have that breadth. You maintain as much breadth as you possibly can, but you then go deep and have a specialism in a particular part. So if you're, as a financial institutions banker, understanding the entire sector, understanding how the sector works together, how banks interact with insurance companies and interact with wealth managers, that makes you a rounder banker and a strategic advisor. But then, of course, do think about specialising in a particular area, because that is the thing that then really, I guess, marks you out from others. So that would be one comment. I think the other thing which I would give, I think it's just actually a good skill set in life, actually, but particularly in business, is never lose sight of the importance of being prepared. And again, there's strange how certain things you just memorize and remember certain things. I can remember as if it was yesterday, being in the Rothschild office on a Sunday afternoon, finalising a pitch deck for a pitch that one of the very senior bankers of Rothschild was giving to a client on the Monday. And I remember getting a call from that banker on that Sunday afternoon, who was sitting at home, who was reading through the accounts of the company that he was going to speak to the following day. And he was down in sort of note 25 on page 70 or something of the annual accounts. And he was ringing up to say, I've spotted this, something. Have we taken into account in our valuation? And that really struck me way back there when I was a junior banker. He was a senior banker, sort of 30 years experience, and yet he recognised, or he felt it was important, that he was prepared. He had been through the annual report. He had the facts to his at his fingertips for that meeting with the CEO the next day. So being prepared, not leaving things to chance. Putting yourself in the best possible position to succeed, whatever your level of seniority, and I think is a lesson well worth bearing in mind.
Thank you very much. That is great advice. I mean, I think you touched on three important points there: that depth and breadth and preparation, and that deeper research beforehand. It goes without saying at these sort of situations. How do you maintain clarity when faced with high stakes decisions?
Look, I think I think you look again. Preparedness is really important in this one, but I think giving yourself the time to make a decision and then reflect on that decision before you move forward is really important. Now, obviously, you can't always do that because you may have an extremely time pressured situation. But it's a bit like that piece of advice about not making a decision at late at night and sleeping on it, or not sending an email when you're angry and just giving your time to reflect on it. But I think you can help with your clarity of thinking if you do the work, make a decision, leave it for a bit, and then come back to it and look at it with completely fresh eyes, because that perspective can help you to drive that clarity. And it's not it's a similar thing to what a piece of advice I used to give to my junior bankers when I was running an M&A team. Often I'd say, look, when you're running a model or doing a pitch book, you often you're running 100 miles an hour. You've got the presentation on whatever day it is, and you're donkey deep in all these pages, and you're doing enough. And I say, look, always try and build in time to finish the work, even if it's just long enough for you to go out and get your lunch and walk around the block and move away from your desk for 20 minutes, and then come back to it just with that fresh pair of eyes. It's amazing the errors or the mistakes or the typos or whatever it is that you just pick up when you come back, just having been away from the focus for even a short period of time.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, it goes without saying. It happens in any kind of situation, but in high stakes decision, if you can build in that time, yes, it just makes a massive difference. It's better to take your time with it and get it right than to
100%. Yeah, no, I really agree with that.
Absolutely. Okay. Let's move into your personal definition of success and how it's evolved over time. How do you define success, both personally and professionally?
Look, how do I define success? I think it goes without saying probably, but doing a good job, delivering things on time, that's a bedrock of it. But I think when I look back on some of I would look back in fact on any of the roles that I've worked in over time, I think the real definition of success is, how do people feel when you move on? So what is that reaction when you at a macro level, when you move on from a role to a different role, when you resign and you move to a different company, but even at a more micro level, when you finish a piece of work, or someone you've been working with moves into a different role. So what is that reaction? What do you leave behind when you are no longer there? What is your reputation? That to me is the real measure of success. If people are sorry to see you go, you've done a good job. If you finish a piece of work or you resign and the response you get is, oh, thank you very much, great, we'll see you later, you probably left something on the table. I think the second point is, do you enjoy yourself? And that's always been a real guiding light for me in terms of the work I've done and the places that I've worked in. I personally have always found value and enjoyment in my job as being a real measure of success, and certainly a measure of whether I want to be doing something.
That's great. Well, thanks for sharing your perspective there. I think they're very, very spot on in terms of how people react after you've left. That's mainly when you know how they feel about you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very good. So this is a question we ask all our guests, and I'm interested to know your view on this. If you were to rank health, wealth, relationships, and purpose, how would you prioritize them and why?
Look, I think it's a cliche, but I'm going to start with it anyway. Look, I think health is more important, the most important thing, because without health, the others are frankly irrelevant. So health, absolutely. I'll go to the other end of the spectrum, and wealth. Wealth is important, of course it is, but wealth has never been. If we mean by wealth, what you earn through your career, through your roles, that's never been the guiding light for me. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're remunerated in the way that you feel you should be and fairly, but that's not been what I've taken as a key determinant in the roles that I've done over my career. And then relationships and purpose, I think those two really go together. So I talked a little bit about at the top of our conversation about the alignment of values between me and the organisation I work with, and when I talk about values, I think I talk about I include purpose in that sort of broader definition. So feeling that I am doing a role which has purpose, which is contributing to whoever it might be, whether it's our client or society, in a way that aligns with my values is really important. And then I've talked about relationships. Anyone listening to this podcast with half an ear will have heard me talk about relationships a number of times, and I really do think relationships are what underpins a large part of what we do. So look, leaving health aside, just because I think it always will come in a category of its own, relationships and purpose have very much been at the heart of, and all the decisions that I've taken over the course of my career, in terms of where I've worked, in terms of what I've actually done.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is a viewpoint that if you have all three, relationships, purpose, and health, the wealth will naturally come, because wealth is relative ultimately. Yes,
I think there's something in that as well, John.
Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing. Appreciate it. Okay, so we're approaching the end, and we have a lighter note with rapid fire questions, and we can fire away on them. Okay.
Okay, great.
So, if you weren't in finance, what profession would you pursue?
Ooh, that's a great question. I guess. Look, I've always really been. I've done a lot of travel during my career. I do less now, but certainly in my 20s and 30s, I spent a lot of time traveling, a lot of time on airplanes, a lot of time in hotels. I've always been fascinated by the economics of running a hotel, and so I think if I had my time again and I had the opportunity, I would love to run a small boutique luxury hotel.
That is fantastic. It's never too late to do that, James.
But actually, strange enough, you say that, John, and I actually do know a chap who I was a lawyer friend of mine in Singapore, and he does now run a hotel in Portugal, which I must go and stay at, actually.
Fantastic. Maybe you could pick up some tips.
Yes.
Okay, next question. What's one personal or professional goal you haven't achieved yet?
I think, well, I'm going to say speak a language. I'm going to learn a language. Ambition suggests that, or goal suggests that I'm going to do it. I don't know whether I am, but I do always feel that maybe I should have spent more time learning a language. Actually, I again, a little anecdote. I remember the first day I was in when I moved to Hong Kong. I sat down with my then boss, and I said to him. My first boss I had in Hong Kong was a British guy who had been in the region for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And I said to him, shall I have a go at learning Mandarin? And he nearly fell off his chair and said, I wouldn't bother, James. Too tricky.
Okay, so just a follow-up question then, what language would you pick?
So I think I love the French language, which of course I did at GCSE. Everyone does, certainly in this country. So I love the French language. I think it's spoken well. It's beautiful. But I think Spanish might be one of the most useful languages to learn in this day and age.
Cool. Thank you very much for sharing. Next question. What's one habit or routine that's made the biggest difference in your success?
Look, I don't know whether it's got to the level of being instrumental to my success, but I've always been an early riser in the morning. And there's a couple of reasons actually. One is because I really don't like travelling on trains when they're busy and packed. So I've always tried to get to my office before it gets too busy. But actually, more importantly, I find that sort of half an hour, 45 minutes of relative calm and quiet in the morning when you get into the office, when there's no one else or very few other people around, that really sets you up for the day. And it goes back to that concept of preparation and giving yourself enough time to prepare for whatever you're doing. And so I've always used that time. I tend to get in the office about 7:30, and that half an hour, 45 minutes before other people come in, it allows me to set myself up for the day. It allows me to prepare for the meeting. Sometimes just finish a piece of work off that I didn't manage to do the day before. But generally, just allows me to set myself up for the day rather than be sort of rushing in and you come in and straight into a meeting and you're not quite prepared, and then always feel you're on the back foot for the rest of the day. So I think that's the thing I'd point to.
Yeah, absolutely right. I totally agree with you and subscribe to that as well. You just have that extra breathing space to take your time, and it's invaluable. So thanks for sharing. If you could master a skill overnight, what would it be?
I think it would be either an electrician or a plumber. I have to say, I am not particularly handy at home, and the number of times where the lights go out, or you have a power cut, or the toilet leaks, or the dishwasher doesn't work, and I must admit, I think being able to be a bit more handy at home and having a trade like that would be really helpful and would make my wife a lot happier.
Those are great skills, invaluable. Thanks for that. Okay, and our last question. Which historical figure would you most like to meet, and what question would you ask them?
So I'm going to pick two, if that's okay, but for similarish reasons. So there were two people who I have always held in very high regard and been very impressed by, because I think they both led their countries through some very, very challenging times. So the first one is Queen Elizabeth I, who was, Queen of England through an extremely challenging period of religious and political uncertainty. And the second one is Lee Kuan Yew, who was obviously the founding Prime Minister of Singapore. And we haven't touched on this, but although I am English, I was actually born in Singapore. So both countries are very, very dear to my heart. Both of these people, I think, played really, really instrumental roles in the development of their countries. I think are both regarded as great leaders. And I think what I would want to ask them is, what did they think were the most important leadership qualities, and how did those qualities guide them through some of the most important decisions that they took when they were leaders of their countries?
Oh, those are great historical figures and a great question to ask them both. Yes, so thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate your time and having you as a guest on Masters of the Deal, and hopefully we catch up again soon.
Not at all, John. Thank you. It's been really entertaining. I've really enjoyed the hour or so. So thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome, James.